The history of Augustana is deeply embedded in the past, influenced by Swedish immigrants who came to the New World as early as 1840, searching for jobs and farmland where they could carve out a decent living and raise a family. Among those Swedish settlers in the railroad community of Montana, later to be named Boone, was a man by the name of Nils Thorson, who had become their leader. He worked zealously to interest as many immigrants as possible to the tall grass country. If grass grew tall and luxuriant, he reasoned, then the wheat, oats, and rye would do likewise. This man Thorson was to play an important role in the early history of our Augustana Lutheran Church. In spite of all these new opportunities, of which they had only dreamed before, the early pioneers never allowed hard work, their successes nor their failures, to crowd out the centering of their life in the gospel. Hoping to keep alive the tradition of the Lutheran faith they had learned back in Sweden, they sought the help of Lutheran ministers who visited the blossoming community of Montana. As early as 1865, the first itinerant Lutheran pastor had made a preaching stop in Montana. The first names mentioned in historical records were Pastor H. Olson and Pastor C.J. Malmberg. It was on February 28, 1870, that a new Lutheran congregation was first organized. It was in the home of Nils Thorson, with Pastor C.J. Malmberg presiding as chairman. The group adopted the following resolutions. 1. The name of the congregation shall be the same as the city, Montana. 2. The constitution of the congregation of the Augustana Synod shall be adopted. And 3. No stranger shall be permitted to speak before the congregation until examined by the Board of Deacons and given permission. Deacons elected were Nils Thorson and L. Smith for 2 years, and I. Thorson and N.T. Lundquist for 1 year. Trustees included Nils Thorson for 3 years, I. Manson for 2 years, and P. Peterson for 1 year. Now, shortly it was necessary to build a church for the growing congregation, and the records are most interesting. At the annual meeting on January 2, 1872, the decision was made to build a new church starting the following April. It would be 36 by 28 feet, and the height was undecided. The foundation was to be brick and the building plastered. John Anderson was elected building superintendent at a wage of $2.25 a day, and Peter Okerlund as assistant superintendent at $1.75 a day. The location was at 6th and Monona. But the path that followed proved to be a thorny one. By 1877, dissension had developed in the young congregation. Disagreement arose concerning biblical teachings. The main issue of disagreement was whether only pure saints should ever belong to church. Thus, on July 25, 1877, a special congregational meeting was held, and a resolution passed that all ties with the Augustana Synod were forever broken, and that the congregation was to be absolutely free of any kind of connections. The reason given in the resolution was that the congregation had grown to full wisdom and needed no supervision. This dissension led to a division of the Montana congregation. The larger part of the membership left the Lutheran Church and started what was to become the Evangelical Free Church in Boone. They also secured control of the church property at 6th and Monona. Sorrow filled the air. But we are here today as witnesses to the gospel promise that faith cannot die because of adversities. So once again, the Nils Thorson home became a temporary place of worship as the remaining members regrouped as a new Lutheran congregation. At a meeting on September 10, 1877, under the leadership of a Pastor M. Spangberg, they rejected the idea of giving up their existence and reaffirmed their desire to remain faithful to our Constitution and union with the Augustana Synod. The signers of this resolution were Nils Thorson, Andrew L. Engstrom, P. Okerlund, J.P. Samuelson, N. Anderson, N.P. Johnson, Frank Nelson, A. Nelson, J.P. Johnson, and P.A. Engstrom. This reorganized Lutheran congregation was first known as the Swedish Lutheran Church. The first pastor called was O.J. Siljeström, who served from 1878 to 1881. During his pastorate, he married one of Nils Thorson's daughters. In 1878, at the annual meeting, the name Augustana was voted to be the personal name of the congregation. It is also noted that the treasurer's book was to be kept in both English and Swedish so that all could read it. Now another church edifice was needed. Contractor Carlson was elected to do the building, and construction started in September of 1879, 2 years after the congregation was reorganized. The location was 715 Crawford Street, which would be just north of our present high school building. A parsonage was built in 1885 at 204 Crawford Street. A place to worship and conduct the business of the church was important to the early congregation. They were excited about their growth and changes to come, and in 1894 they decided to sell the church on Crawford Street and the parsonage. A year later, in August of 1895, they worked out a deal to trade the church and parsonage, plus $3,000, for the Christian Church building on the corner of 7th and Carroll Streets. It had been constructed 5 years earlier in 1890. They also built a home at 710 Carroll Street, which was used as the new parsonage. In 1901, a basement was put under the church and extensive repairs were made, totaling $8,000. This now today is the site of the Stark-Wallin Funeral Home. Having secured physical facilities, the congregation concentrated its efforts on their ministry. The work was carried on among Scandinavian-speaking people. Services were conducted entirely in the Swedish language, and this somewhat restricted the field of ministry. However, the congregation continued to grow in size, nearing the 200 level at the turn of the century, and numbering 258 members by 1914. As the level of immigration from the Scandinavian countries slowed and a new generation was growing up, it became necessary to use English in the worship services. In 1921, the congregation voted to use the English and Swedish languages on alternate Sundays. This arrangement continued until 1926, when all Sunday worship was conducted in English, with a special Swedish service conducted at an earlier hour. In 1931, the congregation voted to discontinue the use of Swedish at all services of the church. This allowed for a widening of the ministry, and a rather rapid growth followed in the ensuing years. Membership reached 500 by 1950. Now, typical of many churches in those days, only the men were permitted to vote. However, the women of the early Augustana congregation played an important role in the growth of the church. The annual meeting of 1882, now with only men allowed to vote, ordered a Ladies' Aid Sewing Society to be organized. The purpose of this group was to raise money to pay debts and buy a new location. Later records show that by 1940, the women raised enough money to purchase an organ for the church and money left over to begin an organ maintenance fund. The end of such money-raising efforts was far from being recorded at that time, however. Our present Augustana Church building, completed in 1960, can be traced from the annual meeting on October 14, 1941. The sum of $32.13 remained on hand after payment of all debt incurred for improvement of the old building at 7th and Carroll. It was decided that the sum would be put in a special fund for future use. Money crept in slowly. War came, but life in Augustana went on. 5 years later, the fund had grown to over $6,000. Talk began to circulate that the fund should be the start of a new church. And it is noted that protests came like, quote, floodwaters after a cloudburst. And a resolution was passed to put the new building idea on a 5-year test to see what would happen. 10 years later, October 1951, the fund had grown to over $18,000. A year later, the fund had mushroomed to over $60,000 in cash and pledges. Although the improvement fund was started way back in 1941, Augustana's expansion program continued to be discussed and debated until 1954, when the present site at South Green and Forest Avenue was purchased. Pastor Einar Oberg served our congregation from 1947 to 1954. During a return visit this year, he recalled some of the memories of planning for the location of the church. He was a part of that decision that the church would be built to the south of Boone rather than the north.
Well, when they dedicated this, we were not able to get here, my wife and I, though we were invited. And I have a beautiful, beautiful commemorative plaque out of black walnut, etc., hanging in my office today, which says very simply, thanks for getting everything started.
Pastor Eugene Nelson followed Pastor Oberg in the fall of 1954 and immediately became involved in the excitement of building a church. During his return visit this year, Pastor Nelson noted that it was at his first annual meeting that the congregation voted to purchase the building site on South Green.
The first annual business meeting I was to was the time that we purchased the lot here at Forest and Green. And so that was a very significant thing. I wasn't here long enough to see the church built here, but I saw some progress in that direction.
Again, the women of the congregation were active in the efforts to raise funds for the new church. They operated a food stand at the Boone County Fair, and for over 25 years they provided one of the community highlights of the winter months, the yearly Augustana Smorgasbord. It was February 1958, nearly a year after Pastor Robert Hurdy arrived, before the actual building plans were initiated. Pastor Hurdy recalls that after his ministry began in Boone, members of the congregation asked him when he was going to start talking about building a new church.
I was here about a year, and this one individual one time asked me, well, when are you going to start talking about building the church? And I answered this person that I didn't come here to build a church. I came here to serve the congregation, which is the church. If you want a new building, you people are going to have to do it. And that went back through this person, and before we knew it, they started planning. And that's a long story. If you want the whole thing, you better have a lot of tape in your camera. But the people became the ones who did the planning and the deciding, and like I said, it was they who did the building of the congregation, because it is they who use this facility to work out of as the people of God, the real church.
On July 30th, 1959, the congregation accepted bids from Boone Construction Company, Pritchard Brothers Plumbing and Heating, and Fitz Electric Company of Dallas Center for construction of our church building. Groundbreaking ceremonies were held on August 16th, 1959, and 11 days later, the actual construction got underway. 1 year later, on September 11th, 1960, the cornerstone was laid. And then on Sunday, December 18th, 1960, an inspired congregation, after a 9 o'clock service in the old church at 7th and Carroll, came in a procession to the new church sanctuary for a worship service. Pastor Hurdy recalls that moving experience.
Each boy in the confirmation class that year carried some item from the old altar and chancel, and we processed in here, each of them, and they were all able to place their item in the specific right place, and everybody was just beaming to be able to go from the old building into this new building. And that probably is one of the most elating experiences that I had as pastor here in Augustana, Boone. And I know that it was very meaningful to practically every member of the congregation at that time.
Dedication took place a month later, January 22, 1961. Iowa Conference President Reverend Raymond Lingwall conducted the rite of dedication along with Pastor Robert Hurdy. The church was constructed at a cost of $197,732. It was designed by Oswald H. Thorson, a Waterloo architect. These words, written by Thorson, were read at the dedication service. Now the builders are finished with the structure, but one essential item of design remains, which can be added only by the congregation. Missing now are the gently worn areas from worshipers' hands grasping the pew edges each Lord's Day. Missing are the traveled areas in the floors testifying to man's longing and gathering for the gift of the Spirit. Missing are the evidences at the altar of our fellowship in Christ through Holy Communion. All these tokens of a vital congregation are the responsibility of the members of Augustana Lutheran Church. May this building stand for this purpose, a hopeful and wonderful setting in which acts of worship and learning will be held to the glory of God and service to man. And what happened to the old church building? At a special meeting on May 24, 1962, the congregation voted to sell the church property at 7th and Carroll to Paul H. Stark for a sum of $16,000. The old building was dismantled, making way for the new home for Stark Wallene Funeral Home. In 1961, the total membership of Augustana was 844 members. By 1968, the figure had climbed to 1,038. As membership increased, it became necessary to hold 2 worship services each Sunday. A coffee hour was instituted between the 2 services to retain the closeness of Christian fellowship. During the decade of the 60s, many of Augustana's ministries offered today were initiated or strengthened. Bible classes for both adults and high school age were offered. Over 200 children under confirmation age were registered in Sunday school. The church sponsored Boy Scout Troop 132, now the oldest in the city of Boone. The new rooms were becoming very well occupied. Pastor Arnold Thurene arrived at Augustana in late 1969, following Pastor Hurdy. Pastor Thurene recalls having the privilege of burning the mortgage.
Coming to minister in a building that had been recently completed, one of the highlights along the way very early on was burning of the mortgage. And after that was completed, then we did do a few renovations. We put a few walls here and there in the educational areas which had been designed for open classroom. I think the highlight about the building for me was the pipe organ, the planning for the new pipe organ with a wonderful committee, and I remember particularly Mrs. Bert Holst, who was chairman of that committee, traveling around visiting organs. But I still remember the day the truck unloaded the new pipe organ that was installed here at Augustana. And I recall one of the things that the builder of the organ was Milt by Moeller was in the front of the church, we always had a screen in front of the pipe work, and the congregation really felt they would like to retain that, but he somehow had forgotten to order that material, and so that's why there isn't anything there, and you can see the beautiful organ. So, and I wish I was in the long run grateful for.
As the needs of the congregation continued to grow, parish assistants were employed. Jane Ryden Shearer was the first one to hold this position. She was followed by Steve Hope, Carolyn Johnson, Kim Knight, Ruth Walzer, and Jean Hesser. And recently we welcomed Tina Lenzer as our youth education director. From 1983 to 1985, Kristen Slaughterhoff served as the first co-pastor of our congregation. She recalls that her arrival prompted an expansion of the church's office space.
When I first came, my office was next to the boiler room down in the basement. I think it had been storage, or maybe the choir had some storage in their robes or something. Or I was right next to where the cabinets had been for the robes anyway, down in the basement. So right away, there was some talk about, well, that wasn't really adequate for an office space, which didn't bother me. In some ways, I was thrilled just to have an office anywhere, but I thought that was an important move for the congregation to say, we need to do something about that. So that's, during the time I was here, then those 2 offices were built. And that was an exciting time, and to move into those and get acclimated. So that was good.
Other associate pastors that followed included Pastor Mark Holmes, who served from 1988 to 1991, and Pastor Jim Durnall from 1992 to 1994. With the completion of a new modern church facility, Augustana's philosophy gradually focused more on outreach, reaching out to the community with an open-door policy. Pastor Dave Abram, who has served our congregation since January 1987, agrees that this is the real mission of Augustana today.
Oh yes, our forefathers who began this congregation began it basically to deal with and to minister to Swedish people with a Swedish language, Swedish liturgy. And so it was, instead of being inclusive, it was somewhat exclusive. Spoke Norwegian or English, you would have not felt very comfortably here. Today, our young people don't speak in terms of their heritage. They don't know their nationalities. In fact is, we're a mixture of all kinds of people, and as we receive people into the fellowship and the family of Augustana today, probably most would not be able to tell you if they were Swedish or German. They're Americans. And also I think the exciting part of the ministry today is being able to reach out and literally bring people into the fellowship of Christ who have had no church background. I think that's the challenge of tomorrow.
Augustana's modernistic church, nestled in the corner of Forest and Green Streets, framed by stately trees with its belfry and cross reaching boldly into the sky, was built 35 years ago on what was once a swampy ravine, a place where some people chose to dump their trash. Pastor Abrams sees a symbolism in it.
Our Lutheran theology speaks of Christ has come to us while we were yet sinners. Because we were sinners, we're talking about the fact that we have trashy lives. And the fact that Christ came to save us, to renew us, to change our lives, to become new people. And as I look at this piece of property, they've made it from a ravine where people maybe have dumped some of their waste in life, and in turn turned it into a new property where it's a mission for the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And that's what the church should be. It should be a place where we are recycling lives for Jesus Christ. We don't do it, the Holy Spirit does it, but we must be inviting enough that people can come in and receive that good news and have new lives. And so I see that very symbolic of the fact that we were built in an area where being changed and made a new people through this new building and a ministry to the community.
This is the story of Augustana Lutheran Church. 125 years of growth and service. A far-sighted congregation founded by people of Swedish heritage. People who saw fit to build a church with a door that is always open to those seeking fellowship and shelter in the community of God.